Hello and welcome to the first episode of the On the Fossil Record podcast, the podcast for some things paleo, with Dean Lomax and myself, Jason Sherburn, and we're going to be chatting about some of Dean's recent research on ichthyosaurs. So Dean, by happy coincidence, you've actually just had a study published, which we can talk about today, on something called Protoichthyosaurus.
Yeah, it's quite a mouthful, isn't it? Yeah, so the full name, Protoichthyosaurus prostaxis. I kind of feel
I wasn't going to try that bit. I'm leaving that to you.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine. I kind of feel like it needs to have a nickname. In fact, that's something I mentioned to the museum curator, that they need to have a nickname. So, you can imagine many of the kids going up, "What's that? Protoichthyosaurus prostaxalis." So I think it's important that they have a nickname for this animal.
Any ideas?
I don't know, kind of something original like Icky the ichthyosaur, but I don't know. Maybe Fred.
Fred.
could be a good one.
And Protoichthyosaurus, the name makes it sound like it's almost an ichthyosaurus, but an ichthyosaur, but it actually is an ichthyosaur, isn't it?
Yeah. So
just for anyone listening who's not sure what an ichthyosaur is. You study them a lot now, don't you? So,
yeah, that's
go ahead.
Yeah, as you know, yeah. So I spent a decade studying ichthyosaurs. So these are a really fantastic group of animals to study. They kind of resemble dolphins and sharks in their sort of overall body plan, but they are reptiles, and they lived at the same time the dinosaurs were sort of walking on land, but they lived in the seas, first appearing about 250 million years ago, and sadly becoming extinct around about 90 million years ago. But they are, as I mentioned, a really fantastic group of animals to study. And Protoichthyosaurus, as you say, it does kind of sound like it's before ichthyosaur, but it's not. It is an example of an ichthyosaur, first described back in 1979 by a paleontologist called Dr. Robert Appleby.
And what's so special about Protoichthyosaurus that you're trying to tell the world about it at the moment?
So I've spent the last probably 5 or 6 years looking at Protoichthyosaurus. So when Dr. Appleby first described it, he kind of he looked at a handful of specimens, sort of, I think it was about 4 or 5 specimens, and he found a really weird forefin. So he found that in the forefins of Protoichthyosaurus, they had a certain number of digits, so a certain number of fingers in their forefin, which was basically unique among all ichthyosaurs in the world at that time, and in fact even is today. But one thing that he hadn't sort of realised is that he had mistaken a couple of his Protoichthyosaurus specimens for being fakes. There was a couple of them in there where they'd been made up by sort of 1 or 2 different ichthyosaurs. So he had one fin from a Protoichthyosaurus and one fin from another type of ichthyosaur, funnily enough, called Ichthyosaurus. And so since his study came out in 1979, literally a few years later, every other ichthyosaur worker said he's wrong. And it was kind of really critical of his work, and you can imagine he'd spent quite some time looking at that, and for it just to be disregarded because essentially people said, oh, they're just, they didn't even recognize that they were fakes as well. They just assumed that they were, just a variation of Ichthyosaurus. So this was just another forefin variation. And so anyway, working on that for the last sort of 5 or 6 years, going over his specimens and others, we've now, working with a colleague of mine, Professor Judy Messere, she and we have examined and found up to almost 30 specimens now of Protoichthyosaurus. Wow. Yeah, and including naming one new species in 2017, which was a specimen at the University of Nottingham, which actually we named after Appleby, so it's called Protoichthyosaurus applebii. And so that was kind of like a big chunk of work that we'd done. We've actually published a couple of papers now on Protoichthyosaurus, recognising these sort of newly discovered specimens, all of them being hidden in museum and university collections. But that kind of brings us round to this new study, which you talked about, and this is an important new study in respect to ichthyosaurs, at least, that it's a really rare specimen. It was originally found in a farmer's field in 1955. Imagine that. being found in a farmer's field.
I'm not sure I've ever found anything useful in a farmer's field.
Yeah, me neither. Me neither. It was a funny story. Again, it was one of these things where, as you know, being a paleontologist, that museums are just treasure troves for collections and things like that. And you literally could walk into a museum collection and you could find something entirely new to science. And I mean, that's what I guess I've been doing for the last decade, looking in museums, just going over sort of historical specimens, what people have collected and looked at. And in some cases, like this one, this specimen, as I said, was found in a farmer's field 1955. At the time, even this guy, Dr. Appleby, he even examined the specimen and he thought that it might be something new to science. And anyway, it was collected from this field, and it was I should point out what it is as well. So it's a really large skull. It's about 1 meter long skull, and there was a partial skeleton with it as well. So there's one of the forefins, there was a hind fin, and lots of the backbone, so lots of the vertebral column. And that specimen then was put into sort of like the Birmingham Museum's sort of trust, and then it was spread between a couple of different museums. But right at that time, sort of like 1956, 57, and sort of Appleby looked at it and a few other people looked at it, and then it was kind of like research just never happened. They kind of just assumed, I think they thought it was just another example of a common ichthyosaur, one of the most common ichthyosaurs in the UK, which you're familiar with, Jason, Ichthyosaurus communis, and then that was it. So it's kind of left in in the museum's basement, I guess, for many years. I think it did go on display at one point, but yeah.
So was it when your friend and colleague Nigel Larkin, was it him getting involved with conserving this specimen that you ended up getting involved with studying it?
Yeah, pretty much. So yeah, Nigel had been asked to work on this specimen in sort of like, it was middle of 2014, and I'd been working with Nigel as well, and obviously at that time I'd already written quite a few research papers on ichthyosaurs, and so Nigel had mentioned to the museum curator of the museum where this specimen is held, the Think Tank Museum in Birmingham, a curator called Luan Mehitia, and Luan also sort of realised I'd been working on ichthyosaurs and said to Nigel, is it worthwhile sort of having Dean involved, and could the two of you work on the project? Sort of Nigel could conserve it whilst I could help him sort of take the specimen apart, take the skull apart, because one of the problems with the skull was that it's a beautiful skull. It's pretty much preserved in 3 dimensions, which is really rare for an ichthyosaur of this age. It's about 200 million years old, lived during the early Jurassic, and most ichthyosaurs from that time are, the most scientific term, pancaked.
I was about to ask you about that term. Yeah. I thought it's an interesting term you've been using.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah,
reading up on this one.
So pretty much they're pancakes. So you think
Squish.
They're squished. So you think of them being sort of like from the top down, being squished out. So they're pretty much preserved in either from the top view, the bottom view, or if not, they're laying on their left or right side. And that's usually how we get them. And usually most of them, if you think of ichthyosaurs in the UK, there's thousands of ichthyosaurs known. Many come from Dorset, Somerset, from Whitby, and then from other locations. So for this one, being 3-dimensionally preserved was really quite rare, and that's what really sort of enticed me to the project, especially with it being quite a big animal, 1 meter long skull, and we estimate that this entire length of the animal up to probably between 3.2 and 4 meters in length, so the sort of top size for a common bottlenose dolphin, so pretty decent sized animal.
And you've been using some very modern techniques on this, haven't you? A bit of CT scanning and some 3D printing as well.
Yeah, quite a bit of that. Yeah, so as part of this sort of project, I'd say it started in 2014, and a year later in 2015, me and Nigel sort of teamed up with an excellent paleontologist who at the time was at the University of Cambridge, Dr. Laura Porro, and then now she's at University College London. And Laura's sort of world renowned, I should say, really for for being able to CT scan specimens and sort of manipulate the data and use that data to sort of like build 3-dimensional models of the fossils. So she's done that quite a lot in different fossils, and so she thought this would be a fantastic project to get involved in. So working with Laura, she first of all, we had sort of individual bones from the skull, which some of them are really rare. You've got parts of the brain case preserved, so obviously the bones that surround the actual brain, and in some instances some of those bones show impressions of the brain, which is quite amazing.
Are there any other examples of ichthyosaur brain cases preserved?
Yeah, there are. So there's a handful of specimens dotted around the world, but in the UK, that is one of probably, very few, especially if it's aged. There's only, thinking out loud, probably couple, 2 or 3 maybe known, and one of them was sort of like an acid prepared one, so it was a specimen that was preserved in a big rock, and it was all sort of removed. The rock was removed by acid preparation, pouring acid on the rock, so that was dissolved away, and then you're just left with the bones. So in this case, obviously for this think tank ichthyosaur, that was slightly different, that it was preserved, and I think it was preserved in a clay, and all the clay was removed, so you had you had the bones left. But so using the scanning data though, we micro CT scanned the brain case bones and the individual bones in the skull, so we could look inside, so like the internal structure of those bones, and see what we could find in there. And then the entire skull itself, we had that CT scanned at the Royal Veterinary College in London, which is the scanners usually used for sort of like horses and things like that. So
we attempted to climb in.
I was tempted to climb in and see what I look like under there at the side of this ichthyosaur. So it was really neat. And by doing that, I mean, you know yourself, obviously we didn't have access to those things, going back many years and that. So, realistically, CT scanners and micro CT scanners and so on and so forth have really opened up an entirely new area for paleontologists to explore and look inside the fossils. I
know you're passionate about being able to share information with other scientists and the public. CT scanning, 3D printing, that just makes all of this even easier in a way, doesn't it? You can send these files over to someone, they can print their own parts if you've got 3D printing going on. They can look at these CT scanned images from the other side of the world without having to come over and look at the specimen or having to send it overseas.
Yeah, exactly. Now, and that's something that's really important now, because, in theory, we could send over all of these scans to, let's say, a colleague of mine in South America, and they could, if they have access to a 3D printer, they could literally print out a 3-dimensional version of our research of that skull, and then they could look at it as well, and maybe they could come to the same conclusions that we have in our study, or maybe they might find something else that's new, because, as you say, it's really quite good to have that. And in fact, with that skull, we did have various parts of it, and in fact parts of the skeleton 3D printed, and that was by a guy called Stephen Day of ThinkC 3D in Oxfordshire, and he did a fantastic job with that. I mean, you look at the skull now, if you look at the specimen, you literally would find it very difficult to tell which is real and which was the replica. And it's important to do that, because the specimen is now on display at the Think Tank Museum in Birmingham. Although it did go on display a year or so ago now, and all of the text needs to be updated since this new study.
And obviously with 3D printing, not necessarily this specimen, but 3D printing fossils, you can send these out to schools and other educational places, and children can handle these without risk of damaging the actual fossil. And it's a valuable resource.
I agree. Yeah, that's really important. And the thing is, obviously, there's a lot of research that's published every year from paleontologists, and it could be a new dinosaur, it could be a new fossilized squid, it could be like my ichthyosaur research, and I think it's important that potentially a lot of school children and general public will see that, and they may wish to see more of it. If they can't actually go and physically see the specimen in Birmingham, if they have access to a 3D printer or even just a computer to look at the sort of 3-dimensional skull on the computer, you can play around the entire skull. So it has opened up such an unusual niche, and potentially I suspect give it a few more years, 3D printing will probably become a lot cheaper, and schools may be able to have access to these things which they can print off at their leisure, which would be pretty cool.
Going back to some of the CT scanning, I read that you found evidence of past curation where they'd reconstructed parts of the fossil, and this wasn't obvious until you CT scanned it.
Yeah, that's true, actually, Jason. That's really true. So, as part of this conservation,
not this conversation,
as part of this conservation project that Nigel led in 2014-15. So, working with him on that, so he pretty much cleaned the entire skull and the skull specifically. and he took off literally so much sort of old glue, even animal glues and things like that, and we found like wood and plaster and stuff built into the skull, into the skeleton. And it wasn't necessarily done for sort of like deceptive purposes to sort of say, hey, this is more complete than what it is. It was literally done just for aesthetics, so if it was going to go on display, it would look more complete. But the thing is, once it was all cleaned up, I then worked with Nigel. We put the skull back together, sort of more anatomically accurate, still not 100% accurate because some of the bones were still quite heavy, so you couldn't sort of, put them in the right order or whatever. But what we ended up doing was having it scanned. There was a bunch of things in the skull that actually were made of plaster, and we had no idea. You look at the bone. One of them was a bone right at the back of the brain case called the supraoccipital, and that, to me, I'd looked at it several times and not even questioned that its authenticity. When we had that scanned, there was one portion of it, wasn't a lot, but there's probably, I don't know, made up less than a quarter of it was actually faked, if you like. It was made up of plaster, and so it was done so expertly well. So having access to these scanners and things is important even in that respect, because historically many of these things weren't necessarily collected for their scientific value. They were collected because they were just something nice to have on the mantelpiece, so to speak. So if you go back 150, 200 years, many of these specimens very much may well have been sort of set into plaster or cement or something like that.
Does it make you want to kind of go around loads of museum collections and just see what you can find that's fake, that was really convincing?
Yeah, I think that'd be a pretty cool idea, wouldn't it? Actually, going around with some sort of like handheld scanner or something, like zoop, that's one. Yep, tick that one off. Yeah, I think that'd be pretty cool.
That's the future of paleontology, Dean.
Yeah, there you go. I think there's a series in that.
Yeah. It does actually make me think of good old Protoichthyosaurus, how you actually had to show that was real early on in your career, didn't you?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, talking in nicknames and stuff. Yeah, so yeah.
I did think of that earlier on when you mentioned coming up with a nickname for it. All I could think was, for those who don't know, Protoichthyosaurus was kept in, was it the education collection at Doncaster Museum and Art Galleries? And they thought it was a cast.
Yes.
And children had genuinely done crayon rubbings and things on this fossil.
Yeah. There's an interesting story, and quite rightly, as you say, just building upon top of that. So I was, at the time, I was 18. I'd come back from working in America, working in Wyoming, sort of digging up dinosaurs. I came back to my hometown, Doncaster, got in touch with Doncaster Museum and inquired what they had in terms of fossils. And I began volunteering at the museum. And they said, we have a fantastic ichthyosaur. And as Jason's pointed out there, it turns out this ichthyosaur, which they thought was a cast, was real. And I identified it as real, and even had its last meal preserved between its ribs, which ended up forming my first scientific paper. It had tiny, like super tiny hook-shaped things preserved in a large sort of dark mass between the ribs. And they are the hooks from the arms of sort of prehistoric squid. So we know that it was feasting on squid before it died. And then leading on to what you say is that, it turns out that was a new species as well. And the first new species I'd named, and we nicknamed it Fizzy, but we named it after the early late Georgian, early Victorian paleontologist Mary Anning of Lyme Regis Dawson. We named it Ichthyosaurus anningae in her honour. Having looked at that education collection myself, and that's an amazing specimen, but I do remember they've got some Archaeopteryx sort of casts there, haven't they? And one of them I do remember was just absolutely awful. I'd love it if it turned out to be real, but it's one of the worst casts I've ever seen. Archaeopteryx number 13 hiding in Doncaster Museum. That'd be funny. Well, you never know. In fact, you remember there was the bones that were apparently said to be from Conisbrough in Doncaster, and they were identified as possible deer, and they were from giant flightless birds from New Zealand. Well, who knows what's in the wonders of Doncaster Museum's basement? I guess me and you, really. We should know. We should. We did spend a lot of time down there. We were allowed to go in, by the way. We didn't just sneak into the basement. Yeah. Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. Thanks for listening to the On the Fossil Record podcast.
This podcast was brought to you by Dean Lomax, Jason Sherburn, and Peanut the dog for this well-timed sneeze. So, Dean, all music has been written and produced by Jason Sherburn.